So, thank you everyone. Pleasure to see you. Thank you very much to the organisers and really looking forward to chatting to you. I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about how we prepare for endurance exercise in the heat. To do that, there's a little bit of a roadmap. We're going to discuss whether heat is a new problem or has it always been there? What does it mean for performance and health? What we can do about it? Do elite athletes do what we think they should do? If not, why? And some general summary tips for all. And if I've got time, we're going to talk about some tech and AI and monitoring within this space. So the first question is a pretty obvious one, and hopefully we all agree that the world is getting significantly hotter, exponentially so over the last 5 to 10 years. The last 4 years have been obviously the hottest on record. If we think of major competitions, so Tokyo for example, and we look forward to Paris, and if any of you were at Doha 2019 World Champs, exceptionally hot and humid conditions, even at midnight. Consequently, we see these sensationalist and evocative images all across the mass media. We've seen unprecedented changes to the way that elite sport is competed within. For example, in Tokyo, we saw promptly after the Doha World Championships, the road races moved from Tokyo to Sapporo unsuccessfully when you look at the weather conditions in both cities. We've seen major competitions such as the World Cups change seasons. We've seen the laws of the games change. We've seen fixtures and races changed at the very last minute. For example, at the Muscat World Racewalking Championships, if we would have prepared for the seasonal average of around about 20 degrees early spring in Muscat, we actually saw 31 WBGT at 6 o'clock in the morning. So heat continues to be a challenge. If we think about Paris, where there's no air conditioning, those athletes are going to have to live without AC, train, warm up, any multi-eventers, and potentially half the days above 30 degrees C, maybe over 40 with dirty water and potentially mosquitoes because there's no AC, so the windows are going to be open in the athletes' village. If we look prospectively through to LA, a couple of 100 miles away from the hottest ever temperature ever recorded on the planet, Tokyo 2025, hot and humid, similar to the Olympics, and numerous World Cups across numerous countries. It's going to be very, very hot. The challenge really is we have more sports in a hotter world, and we have these elongated seasons for most sports, track and field included. So we've got more competitions with a shorter winter, a longer summer. So inevitably, we're going to have more competitions in the heat. Additionally, if we use a UK context, for example, the real challenge is moving from winter into spring and hot spring days. So if the marathon was last weekend when it was 22 degrees C, we've moved from a spectacularly wet and cold winter, especially if you've just moved back from Doha, through to 22 degrees C, with a variety of athletes from the top to the bottom of the performance spectrum. And the real challenge there is that we haven't developed seasonal acclimatization. Marathons in the UK at the end of the summer are not the same problem as London on a hot day. So season acclimatization is really important. And of course, the seasons are longer and being brought into those spring months. So the simple answer is it's going to get hotter, but it's probably always been hot. We've just probably not publicised it quite as much as we used to. So 3 major competitions and 3 athletes. We've got the former Empire Games, Jim Peters, Gabby Anderson from the LA Games in '94, and Callum from the Melbourne Commonwealth Games. Quick pop trivia question. What occurred for the first time at the LA '84 Olympics with regards to the marathon? Yes, I thought you might get the answer. Yeah, crazy to think that was the first marathon. So just a quick video to contextualise what happens if we don't prepare appropriately over quite a large time frame.
Afternoon, stricken Englishman entered the gates of Empire Stadium to write an agonizing chapter into the history of international games.
Dazed and dehydrated, he collapsed just 220 yards short of his goal inside Empire Stadium with the nearest competitor miles behind.
Be such a roar go up when this girl crosses the line. The agony and the
I made it, and These are really worrying moments for Callum Hawkins. He's just collapsed. And I think the dehydration and the weather and the savage pace he produced at the start might be getting to him. He's desperately trying to carry on here.
Callum, unfortunately, has got himself in a situation where he may not even finish.
Oh, this is such a shame for Callum Hawkins. He is so brave and so talented. It is boiling hot here, just past 20 past 10 in the...
Okay, we'll leave it there. You get the point. If we don't respect the heat and we don't prepare for it, or we've been even mildly sick in the lead up to the race, we're highly susceptible to these types of things occurring. As I said, it's always been hot. If we look back to some of the historic games, even in relatively recent memory, we've had some very hot days. I think it's really important to carefully delineate or separate an athlete that's hot and bothered and not expressing their true performance capacity and someone having a serious exertional heat stroke, i.e. a serious cascade of medical events. It's okay to be hot and bothered when you're exercising if you're prepared appropriately, and on the extreme end of the scale, if there's prompt treatment available, generally things are okay. But we're talking about mitigation versus serious medical consequences. So just to put that into context, these are the UCI World Cycling Championships in Doha in 2016. So this is the couple of the three girls teams that made the podium from the time trial. These are their core temperatures from those teams when they finished. So any of you that are A&E docs, if someone comes in with one of those temperatures, you'd probably be scurrying at some point and very concerned. This is them 20 minutes before they went to the podium. If you speak to the practitioners for those teams, those girls look like that after every race, irrelevant of the conditions. So remarkably tolerant to high core body temperatures if you're well prepared. Todd's going to do a much better job at this than me, so I'll leave that all to him. From my perspective, as an applied sports scientist working in this space, as soon as we see any kind of slurred speech, gait disruption, cerebral involvement, we're really worried. Call very, very quickly, then move for care. Todd will cover all of this, and there's lots of great resources out there. So to understand what we can do about it, it's important to understand why that happens, and it lends it to us to being able to use these mitigation strategies. So the conceptual heat balance equation governs all of these approaches, why the bad things happen and how we can mitigate them. It's obviously a very dry equation, so we'll use a slightly more applied construct. So we've got our green person here who's running the London Marathon tomorrow. They're producing heat as a consequence of locomotion, so they're consuming oxygen. Unfortunately, as humans, we're very inefficient at generating motion and locomotion through the consumption of O2. The byproduct is heat. So we're generating heat as a consequence of movement. We're also directly and indirectly acquiring heat from the environment around us. So we're acquiring heat, we're generating heat. As humans, we generally want to maintain our core body temperature around 37 degrees C. So we try to lose that heat. We do that through two principal mechanisms. The first of which is dry heat exchange at the skin surface, convection, radiation, typically low percentages, low single figures of heat loss. The king or queen in this space is wet heat exchange, evaporative heat loss. So that is sweat onto the skin, it evaporates from the skin, through phase change we liberate the heat to the environment that's around us. The challenge is when that environment around us is very humid, so the water vapor pressure is very high. There's nowhere for that sweat to go. So a classic example you're all familiar with, if you're doing your spin class or on a watt bike when you're injured or whatever you're doing, there's a huge pool of sweat when you finish. That's basically absolute wasted biological resource. Because it's not evaporated, it's just sweated, you've just sweated on the floor and you've got to clean it up. That's why we're on the turbo, we have a great big fan in front of us to encourage evaporative heat loss. But if we can't sweat, in a Doha marathon, for example, rapid increase in body tissue temperatures. So if our gain plus our production is not met by dissipation, we have a rapid rise in body tissue temperatures. Initially, performance is decremented. If left unchecked, you get very sick and all death is untimely, but you can potentially die. So in terms of why this decrements performance, this is a very complicated, but I'll make it simple, integrative model of why this occurs. We have an increase in body tissue temperatures. They conspire to alter cardiovascular function. Very simply put, we don't deliver what we need to the muscle or remove what we want to, and our ability to lose heat through thermoregulation is compromised. If that rise in body tissue temperatures continues, we have decremented performance, exertional heat illnesses, exertional heat stroke. How big is that decrement? It depends on the sport. But if we look at the Doha World Champs in terms of the marathons, we're looking at 20%. The prior World Championships, probably anything between 3 and 5%. And there's a variety of other sports on that slide as well for context. So what does this mean for performance? If you're an elite athlete sat in the room, you want to know what percentage am I looking at, how do I adapt my pacing, how do I not blow up in the race? So this is really cool data. Along the x-axis, we've got marathon time in minutes. This data is taken from the top 3 male and female finishers for about 26 years across all the major marathons. Really interesting data. On the y-axis, we've got the performance decrement in percentages, and then each of the lines represent a WBGT, wet bulb globe temperature. That's an integrated index of how hot the environment is, including humidity, temperature, wind speed, those types of things. So if you look at the quick guys and girls around about 130 to 150 minutes, we can see at 25 WBGT about a 4 to 6% decrement in performance. You're certainly not going to run a PB in the heat, especially if it's a hilly course. If we look at the model data from the World Athletics Championships from 1999 to 2011, pretty simple relationship. The longer the event, the hotter it is, the greater the performance decrements. We didn't really have any extreme data until the Doha World Championships. Anybody that was there would realise it was pretty warm and humid. And here we are seeing performance decrements between 15 and 24, 25% in a world-class field just prior to the Tokyo Olympics. 0 wind speed, 80% humidity, 31, 32 WBGT. Bearing in mind this is at midnight, so it's not even during the day. So, simple answer to that initial question, endurance performance in the heat is reduced. Can we mitigate it? Yes, but we're certainly not going to run a PB in the heat. We're not magicians. So mitigation, 2 principal mechanisms. We have heat acclimatization, a long-term approach, and we have complementary strategies, cooling and hydration, proximal to the race day. How much mitigation do we need? A lot is the simple answer. And remember, anything we do should be altering this conceptual heat balance equation in some way. We start cooler, we offset those perceptions, we change the skin's temperature to encourage evaporative heat loss. So remember, conceptual heat balance equation and our green person exercising. So the long-term strategies, hopefully you're all screaming out the answer, heat acclimation is king or queen in this space. Provides the most robust protection to athlete health and performance. We have over a century's worth of data in this space, and just to contextualise that for you, we'll use 4 or 5 of the key adaptations we get from heat acclimatisation. Exercising and resting, heart rates and core temperatures, plasma volume, so what we sweat from, and the sweat process itself, and how these consolidate to improve performance or capacity in the heat. So this is a systematic review. Any of you that are unfamiliar with forest plots, essentially anything moving to the left or right of that 0 point, that means something's changed. The length of the line is how much it's changed by. We generally want them to move left or right, depending on if it's a positive or a negative relationship, and we want it as far away from that 0 point as possible. If we look at those key adaptations, so performance and capacity, resting and exercising heart rates and core temperatures, sweat rates and plasma volumes, and then the abbreviations are pretty self-explanatory. ST is short-term, LT is long-term. It's really clear, long-term heat acclimation, most robust protection to athlete performance and health. The next question, if you're preparing an elite athlete, is I've invested all this time in becoming acclimated. How long do I keep those adaptations? How do they decay? How enduring are they? And it's a real good point of practice. A really nice thing from this other systematic review is that, let's say, for example, early in the season you do a 15-day heat block, you procure this nicely adapted heat acclimatized phenotype. If we go back relative to several key competition dates across the cycle, we probably only need to use between 8 or 12 additional top-ups. So we get more bang for our buck if our athletes already had a robust block of acclimation. That means we can invest less time resource later, and we can maintain the quality of the training stimulus. So it just makes absolute sense to have them robustly acclimated pre-season, top it up regularly so we can maintain the training impulse to improve the performance capacity. And it makes sense, the longer you do this for, the more enduring they are. Quite a bit of variability, a little bit of sex variability as well. How we do this, we either choose a natural approach, so we go for a nice Cape Town, UK winter training camp, or we go for an artificial approach, which could be a heat chamber, or it could be hot water immersion, sauna bathing, additional clothing, a combination thereof. The core aspects of that, irrelevant of the approach which is used, is 14 days of exposure, ideally, heavy sweating, high skin temperatures, and high core temperatures, a minimum exposure of 60 minutes, and we want to be preparing for the worst, i.e. what is the worst possible conditions that athletes are going to prepare for. We don't want to hope for the best. Classically, we'd do this in a heat chamber, and that's Arabic, finished, everyone should be acclimating, that should be the end of our conversations. However, we know, even with a century's worth of data telling us exactly what we need to do, it doesn't happen. If we look at the Beijing World Championships, for example, only 13% of the long-distance athletes surveyed did any heat prep at all. So there's definitely something, a barrier, stopping us translating evidence-based practice, the best evidence into practice. If we look at a variety of World Championships, we've seen the adoption increase with the surveyed athletes, but we're still hovering between 50 and 65%. When we know that acclimation is the king or queen of those strategies we have available. So we were really interested in this because, luckily I'm a practitioner as well, but we sit in our academic rooms and we go, you should be doing this, crack on and do that. We assume it's going to happen, but it doesn't work like that. So we were really interested to understand those barriers. This is just the same data graphed in a slightly different way. So whilst at Aspetar, we put together some resources deliberately prior to the Doha 2019 champs to educate the athletes and all of their stakeholders and other practitioners of what to do for the heat. And we're pretty confident that that improved adoption prior to Doha, plus we've got Tokyo on the horizon. Interestingly, when we asked the athletes in Muscat, in a variety of languages as well, this wasn't just in English, if they were aware of the revised Beat the Heat resources, 83% weren't aware. So just really stresses the importance of the governing body and the federations to reinvigorate these educational resources, and they can be effective. And of course, Tokyo was COVID affected. So what were the main barriers? Hopefully, you can all guess what they were. Cost is important to access and facilities and travel, access to knowledge and facilities, and being from a cold environment generally makes things much more trickier to do stuff rather than living in San Fran, for example, where it's pretty good all year round. And surprisingly, we saw the females generally adopted less of these heat-related heat-related preparation approaches. And if we were being super polite about the athlete and the practitioner knowledge, this is the politest way we could say it for the paper. So some biologically implausible and or non-evidence informed answers from athletes and practitioners. So the athletes, fair enough, but the practitioners, which could be doctors, physios, physiotherapists, simple questions. What's the maximally biologically tolerable temperature for a human? We've got 50 degrees C. What's the minimum? We've got 20. And really, we should all know that it's not quite that bad. And there are some other horror stories in there as well. So we should be acclimating our athletes. We have some We can improvise with other strategies. If we're struggling to get that into their training regime or periodization for the year, it doesn't really matter if you come from a cold country, there's generally a solution available. Callum, for example, after Melbourne, he basically had a wooden shed in his garden in Scotland, which is always cold and wet if you're not from the UK, and bought some heaters from one of the supermarkets up the road, and he came fourth at Doha in a world-class field after her horrendous exertional heat stroke. So in the UK, we'd say there's lots of Blue Peter approaches available to make these types of things work. And I have to be careful saying that because I'm getting old and it doesn't generally resonate with the undergrads anymore. So just to wrap things up, in the heat acclimation space, a century of data, we know what to do. Implementation is generally the challenge that we have in this space. A paucity of a genuine elite athlete's data in that space, especially the girls. And it's really about planning your year out, acclimating early, topping up when you need to. Lots of alternative strategies, they don't have to be sexy solutions. Short-term prep, again, we're manipulating that conceptual heat balance equation. We can cool the athlete prior to, during or after the exercise bounce. If we look at pre-cooling, we're generally looking to physically change those body tissue temperatures, whether that's through ingestion, immersion, or application of a cold fluid body or medium. And there's a variety of approaches we can do that. This is the data from some of the athletes prior to Doha. You can physically see the differences in the type of cooling approaches which were used. In terms of mid-cooling, as any of you know, it's very difficult to physically cool the body during high endurance-based activity in well-trained athletes. We're generally looking to slightly reduce the rate of change in body tissue temperatures, and the key thing is changing the perceptions of those temperatures. You feel cooler than you actually are, and we're manipulating the gradient between the core and the skin temperature, and thus the environment around you, and we're transiently altering that conceptual heat balance equation. Different ways we can do that, we're generally looking at pouring, ice collars, ice hats, all those types of things. And there's some really good laboratory data in this space that by just manipulating the thermal perceptions, not the physical body temperatures, we can improve endurance performance in pretty well-trained athletes in very robustly designed projects. And there's emerging data from the real world as well. And again, this isn't groundbreaking science. We're not going to win a Nobel Prize. The French were doing it years ago, so we're definitely not going to, are we? Farah, when he was competing at a high level, Evan at Rio, for example, these are not new strategies. And obviously at Doha, the athletes couldn't get enough of it because it was absolutely boiling. So we acclimate either in a sexy chamber or a non-sexy shed, bath, whatever it may be. We have complementary strategies, which include cooling, pre or during the event, afterwards, generally emergency reasons or just to improve athlete comfort, and then hydration as well. So in terms of hydration, and I'm a big proponent of keeping things really simple. So first of all, the strategy should start in the days leading up to the competition. Secondly, the competition strategy starts a few hours before the race, so urination, and those types of things, and fluid absorption has occurred so the athlete's comfortable before they start. In competition, we're generally aiming for around about a maximum of 2% body mass reduction. Very well-trained athletes in the heat, this is going to be impossible. You're not going to get enough fluid into them. If you do, they're definitely going to be sick. So we're just sensible in this space. The question I get a lot is, what should it be made of? Carbohydrates and electrolytes. Most people running the marathon would probably be okay with 40 to 60 grams an hour, around about there, with a good source. If you're a slightly slower runner, maybe get some real food inside you. Gut habituated athletes, especially cyclists, we can get some very high carbohydrate absorption levels to 100 grams an hour. The biggest thing I'd say is most commercially available beverages don't have enough electrolytes in them. So capsules, electrolyte capsules are really good for that population. They can go in your running belt. So a high quality buffered electrolyte capsule, something that's informed sport tested, would be really good. Hyponatremia is a horrible thing that's going to happen. Todd will probably talk about that. Quite an easy way to avoid that for slower runners, sweating a lot, drinking a lot of water. The big thing is practicing these things. You wouldn't rock up to a championship and say, right, I'm going to take these gels, I'm going to do this, I'm going to guzzle all of this ice slurry. well practiced and piloted, a menu of options available, take the race day temperature, implement your plan. So we all sit, as I say, unfortunately sit in both camps, both an academic and researcher and a practitioner. We sit in our academic palaces, dictating what everyone should do. The wrong person speaks to the athlete, they're turned off in 10 seconds. What's really important to myself and my group is communicating these findings to the people that need them. So most of our papers now have these nice, beautiful infographics in them that can go up in the locker room, easily palatable, multiple languages. A doctor called Sarah Carter does these, who's based in Charles Darwin University, a key collaborator and thermal physiologist. She's a far better graphic designer than I am. But we've put together these recommendations, which are evidence-based, to satisfy the academics and the academically orientated practitioners, as well as the athletes and those who maybe their English isn't their first language or whatever it may be. So just to summarise that, the biggest thing is just be sensible, practice it. If you're going to drink an insane amount of fluids, which you don't need, make sure you take the electrolyte capsules, for example. There are some things that can go wrong. If you're aggressively cooled, it alters your pacing strategy at the early part of the race, so you go off like a rocket. It's important to understand running by your watch rather than your feel until your body tissue temperatures and that central to peripheral integration is caught up with itself. And you can negatively affect the sweat onset response. So I'd normally say you probably want to start the cooling once sweating started. That's probably a good way to start that. And plan and be sensible. So just wanted to show to you what a successful strategy looks like. So if you're aware of an athlete called Evan Dunphy, fortunately a good friend of mine, very open on Twitter, very much athlete-centred and a good advocate for what athletes need and want. He's also got an MSc in kinesiology, so sport and exercise science to us. So definitely give him a follow. He's hoping to medal at Paris as well. And you can probably recognise my bald head. And the other chap in the red top is Trent Stellingworth, another great person to follow on Twitter, very good practitioner from Canada, the Canadian Institute. So Evan often says that hot conditions are an equaliser. I don't know if we agree or disagree, but I think they're a performance opportunity, irrelevant of what country you live in. If you get your prep right, as shown with Callum, you can be fourth in a world-class field, not long after having a horrendous EHS. So for me, I think they're a really good performance opportunity. Maybe I'm biased. So just an example of this, Evan went through Rio, Doha, didn't get a medal at Doha, bronze in Tokyo. Really good prep, really well prepared, a menu of options, stuck to it, trusted the process, trusted his watch early on. If we look at someone like Johan Deniz, who's the current, well, he'll be forever, I would imagine, the 50k world record holder because the race is now defunct. Never prepares for the heat, some horrendous pictures and toilet-related issues from numerous races and basically DNFing in anything that was remotely hot because he didn't prepare. If you read French and you can see the slide, he's basically saying it's glad the races moved to Sapporo. It was still hot and humid and he bombed out of that race as well because he hadn't prepared. So that's just one athlete. Just wrap things up by talking about multiple athletes at the Doha World Championships. So a really big team of people there, great collaboration to be involved with, some very cool data. So we had real-time thermography looking at skin temperature, ingestible core temperature pills to understand core temperature, and understanding what practice is and asking athletes what they did. Long story short, because I just got the white card from Courtney, is if you acclimated, you finished higher, your ranking was better, and you finished with a lower body temperature. Pretty much irrelevant of how you acclimatized. Second thing, most athletes utilised pre-cooling, probably not effectively. Most of them didn't have the best strategy. There was no point warming up in Doha, it was boiling. In terms of mid-cooling, nearly everyone did it and they were desperate to use them. Caps, ice collars, whatever approach you used. So, what does it look like using a successful mid-cooling strategy to manipulate skin temperature? So 3 figures across the bottom. Essentially, we're showing that if your skin temperature was lower, you were more likely to finish the race. If your gradient was more favourable, so your core temperature compared to your skin temperature, so your skin temperature was lower, so the heat's moving from your periphery to your extremities, you were also more likely to finish the race. If you also had that more favourable skin temperature, you were less likely to DNF by collapsing on the track or visit the medical tent. Clearly showing that acclimation works, effective mid-cooling strategy also works. And then those athletes that had a lower pre-race skin temperature, faster completion time, and we couldn't identify a specific cooling method, but pre-race skin temperature was related to performance, and it moved us away from this core temperature-centric model of elite performance, where we're obsessed with the core temperatures. We've shown in non-medically compromised individuals, they can tolerate a remarkably high core temperature. Skin temperature is really important from a performance perspective and in terms of medical perspective, in terms of DNFs and illness presentation. And these are our guidelines within that space. So just to wrap things up, heat acclimation works, cooling and hydration can be beneficial, knowledge is variable in this space, and I think the governing bodies and the federations have a key role to play in this. Education works really well. We need athlete advocates and have athletes involved in the process. So I'm not going to talk about technology and monitoring.
Lee, why don't you use your question time to briefly talk about AI?
Okay, cool. So I'll rewind my brain. So there's lots of chat about tech. Anyone who's anything from a recreational to a high-level athlete here probably got a Garmin on. My wife made me change my watch because she said it didn't look very nice because it's a scabby old Garmin. She stood at the back, so if you all look at her, you can shame her into letting me wear it next time. But we've probably all got a wearable within reach of us at the moment, even if it's just our phone. Some provide good data, some provide bad. And there's been lots of chat in this space, especially leading up to Tokyo. Now we're leading up to Paris. From our space, we like collecting the data so we understand what's happening. So like the Doha data, for example. And this, you can just about see, is a dashboard of an elite athlete in the 10K final in Tokyo. So that athlete's got an ingestible core temperature pill, skin temperature, some gait pods on their feet, some heart rate data. We've got all the environmental data. And you can see them running around the track. I was watching that on my phone in Doha. We had someone on the IOC committee watching it in the stadium. Obviously, there's some competition regulations where you can't feed that back to the athletes or the coaches. But that's pretty cool. And this is a few years ago, and this system is much, much better now. Basically, see them finish very hot, high core body temperatures. Not unexpected. But that raises lots of interesting questions, because we know that athletes can tolerate remarkably high core temperatures. So probably even 4 or 5 years ago, if one of the medical staff saw someone with 41.5 degree core temperature, they're probably pretty keen to pull them out, and they could be running the best ever race to secure them sponsorship and a place for 4 years. So there's lots of ethical considerations, very individual responses to the heat. So that's me finished. So thank you very much for your attention.